that the student would be able to learn about the new visions of psychology, examine the Indian perspective of self and especially Sri Aurobindo's perspective of self, and evaluate the contribution of the integral perspective of self. Now let us come to the introduction of this topic. One of the deepest needs we have as human beings is to know and understand our own self and others. The questions about our origin, dimensions of our human nature and the potential continuously haunt us. This quest for self knowledge is reflected in almost all fields of human inquiry and more so in the discipline of psychology. Sri Aurobindo made several observations about the nature and scope of Western psychology as it was in the earlier part of the 20th century. The psychologists of that time, according to Sri Aurobindo, make three major initial errors that have hampered the study of the human phenomena and the achievement of profound knowledge. These are the error whereby psychologists identify the study of mental processes and behavior with biological and physical sciences. Second, the skeptical error which hinders investigation of the nuances of human existence. Third, the objective mistake made by psychologists to study others as passive observers or from outside instead of viewing knowledge and experimentation within himself or herself. Sri Aurobindo too believed that psychology ought to be a science. However, according to him, it ought to be a science of consciousness and its operations, with a methodology that is significantly different from the natural sciences. According to him, we must proceed from knowledge of oneself to the knowledge of others, because psychology is essentially a subjective science. The main method of psychology, therefore, has to be primarily introspective and experiential in nature. Our surface personality, according to Sri Aurobindo, is a tiny part of the being and does not encompass the depths of our character, mental processes and behaviors. Sri Aurobindo considered psychology as it was in the half of this century as an infant science which was rash and fumbling in its approach. With specific reference to psychoanalysis, he stated, "This new psychology looks to me very much like children learning some summary and not very adequate alphabet, exulting in putting their A, B, C, D of the subconscious and the mysterious underground superego together, and imagining that their first book of obscure beginnings is the very heart of real knowledge. They look from down up and explain the higher lights by the lower obscurities. But the foundation of these things is above and not below. The superconscious, not the subconscious, is the true foundation of things. The significance of the lotus is not to be found by analyzing the secrets of the mud from which it grows here. Its secret is found in the heavenly archetype of the lotus that blooms forever in the light. The self chosen field of the psychologist is besides poor, dark and limited. You must know the whole before you can know the part, and the highest before you can truly understand the lowest. That is the promise of the greater psychology awaiting its hour, before which these poor gropings will disappear and come to nothing. Thus, according to Sri Aurobindo, a complete psychology must be able to map the full complexity of the human consciousness, its inner depths, its width and heights. To fully understand this complexity, the psychologists need to refer to the metaphysical basis of the psychological phenomena.
Aurobindo's perspective of self. From the viewpoint of Sri Aurobindo's thought, the human being is not separated from but is one with the universal being. There are two systems, a concentric system and a vertical system, which are simultaneously active in the organization of the being and its parts. The concentric system is a series of rings comprising of the outer being, the inner being, and the inmost being. The outer being and the inner being form our phenomenal or instrumental being, belonging to nature or prakriti. Physical, vital, and mental are its three corresponding parts. The Purusha, the true being, is the inmost being. The Purusha comprises of an inmost mental, an inmost vital, and inmost physical. At the very core is the psychic being or soul. The psychic being is usually referred to as the inmost being. The vertical system resembles a staircase comprising of different levels, planes, or gradations of consciousness. It ranges from the lowest, the inconsistent, to the highest, Sachchidananda. Ancient Indian wisdom divided the human beings, the microcosm, as well as the world being, the macrocosm, into a higher hemisphere, Paradha, and a lower hemisphere, Aparadha. The higher hemisphere is where the spirit reigns perfectly and internally. In the lower hemisphere, the spirit is veiled by mind, life, and body. Over mind is the intermediary plane dividing the two hemispheres. The main parts and planes of the being as described by Sri Aurobindo are explained below. The outer being. The outer or surface being has three main parts: the mind, the life natural, and the body. Though in our ordinary awareness we are unable to distinguish among these parts, each has its own distinct type of consciousness. We tend to regard the mental, vital, and physical constituent of our consciousness, and all these diverse elements simply as our mind. In yoga psychology, mind refers to the part of the being which has to do with cognition and intelligence. Desires, feelings, instincts, and impulses constitute the vital being or life nature. The body, which is prana, is emanated by the life energy, which is an aspect of the vital. The body's own distinct consciousness operate in the involuntary function of the different physiological systems. Body consciousness is one part of the physical consciousness. Is also include the physical mind and the physical vital, which will be presently explained. Though separate and distinct, the three main divisions of the outer being just mentioned are intertwined, giving rise to clear subdivisions in the main parts of the being. Thus, beside the mind proper, there is a vital mind, which is the part of the mind that is intermixed with the vital. The vital mind, unlike the thinking mind, is not governed by reason but is dominated by impulses and desires of the vital, and seeks to rationalize actions resulting from the desires of the vital. Another subdivision is the physical mind, which is the part of the mind that is intermixed with the physical and takes up the characteristics of the physical consciousness, such as inertia, obscurity, and mechanical repetitiveness, doubt, and obsessive thoughts. The part of the mind which is closest to the physical is called the mechanical mind. Its characteristic is that of a machine that goes on turning round and round whenever thoughts occur in it. Another subdivision which is important for self-understanding is the physical vital. It is the part of the vital which is turned entirely upon physical things and is full of desires and seekings for pleasure on the physical plane. Closely connected with it is vital physical, the part of the vital force which constitutes the nervous being. It is the vehicle of the nervous responses and is related to the reactions, desires, and sensations of the body. The inner being, the subliminal. Behind the surface or frontal consciousness of the outer being, there is an inner or subliminal consciousness of all the three levels: physical, vital, mental. Thus, there is an inner mind, an inner vital, and inner physical. The inner physical is in touch with the universal physical forces around us, the inner vital with the universal life forces, and the inner mind with the universal mind. Thus, whereas the outer being knows only indirectly as perceived through the senses and the outer mind, the inner being is directly aware of the surroundings that act through us. The inner or subliminal being through the circumconscient projects itself beyond the body. The innermost being, the psychic being. Sri Aurobindo uses the term psychic being from the Greek physikal, meaning the soul. For the innermost being, the psychic being is a portion of the divine or a spark present in all things and creations. In the course of evolution, the psychic grows into an individual psychic personality in the human being and is then called the psychic being. The psychic being is the evolving soul which goes through the cycles of physical birth and death, growing from life to life, whereas the Atman, the universal self, is unborn and is above the evolutionary process. The inconsistent. The inconsistent is sometimes known as the non-being or ast and is characterized by darkness, inertia, insensibility, disharmony, and disintegration. It harbors forces that maintain the negativity, the unconsciousness, pain, suffering, illness, death, disharmony, and evil. It also includes all that is divine and striving to evolve into light, consciousness, power, perfection, beauty, and love. The subconscient. This is the half conscious part in us. Sub means below the consciousness. In the subconscient, there is an obscured mind full of obstinate sanskara, impressions, associations, fixed notions, habitual reactions formed by our past, and obscure vital form of the seeds of habitual desires, sensations, nervous reactions, and obscure material that governs much that has to do with the conditions of the body. It is largely responsible for our illnesses. Chronic or repeated illnesses are indeed mainly due to the subconscient and its obstinate memory and habit of repetition of whatever has impressed itself on body consciousness. The subconscient is the cause why people say that the character cannot be changed, the cause also of constant return of things one hopes to have got rid of forever. All that is suppressed without being wholly got rid of the sinks down there and remains as a seed ready to surge up or sprout at any moment. The superconscitent. The superconscitent consists of higher levels of consciousness above the ordinary mind from which the higher consciousness comes down into the lower planes of the being. The role of the superconscitent has been to evolve slowly the spiritual man out of the mental half animal. The superconsistent include the higher planes of mind, higher mind, illuminate, intuition, and overmind, as well as what is beyond mind, namely supermind and the supreme reality called Sachchidananda. The psychic being and transformation. In spiritual experience, there exists one soul being, one soul existence which embraces all being and existing things in the universe, and which in spiritual realization is experienced as the one self of one things and creations. But in our ordinary experience, we perceive the world as inhabited by a plurality of beings and things existing outside what we felt to be ourself. This is because our true self, described previously as the Purusha, who is one with the self of all things and beings, has identified itself through ignorance with Prakriti, its outer instrumental nature made up of body, life, and mind. This identification of Purusha with Prakriti has led to the formation in us of an ego. physical, vital, and mental, which gives us the sense of a self that is separate from the rest of the universe. Thus, it is the ego that gives rise to the distinction ingrained in our ordinary consciousness between what we feel to be our self and the rest of the universe, which is perceived as the not self. Also, it is the ego, physical, vital, and mental, which, due to its complexity and heterogeneity, leads to the formation of multiple self, causing division, conflict, disharmony, and disorganization in our outer being. Harmonization and unification of the outer being can be brought about only by discovering our innermost being, Chaitya Purusha, or the psychic being, and the organizing the outer being around the psychic as its center and governing principle. The aim of spiritual quest in the past has generally been to obtain liberation from the bondage to suffering caused by the illusionary sense of a separate self, the ego, and thereby escape from the perpetual cycle of death and birth. According to Sri Aurobindo, the farthest goal of evolution of spiritual beings goes beyond emancipation and transformation of different constructs of the spirit, which are physical body, mind, and life as a whole, so that the empire of the spirit on Mother Earth could be set up. It is when the outer being is unified and governed by the psychic being that the transformation of mind, life, and body becomes possible through sadhana. Integral Yoga Psychology. Sri Aurobindo's Integral Yoga is psychology in action, aimed at bringing about the transformation of individual consciousness. The main objective of Sri Aurobindo's Integral Yoga is not just a transmutation of consciousness to progressively higher spiritual levels, but its radical transformation with an aim of manifesting the supramental consciousness, which is an evolutionary principle that transcends the human mind altogether. The study of the processes of achieving this transformation can be called the integral yoga psychology. This process of transformation requires the individual to progressively psychicize, spiritualize, and suprematize his or her consciousness. In this process, there is not only an ascent to the highest divine consciousness by the human aspirant, but also a descent of the divine consciousness into the lower mental, vital, and physical being, which transforms the whole individual radically. The aim of integral yoga is thus to bring about evolution towards a supramental principle beyond the mind, which require the conscious collaboration of the human with the divine. The psychology of inner development. According to Sri Aurobindo, it is fundamentally an evolution of consciousness that has been taking place in nature. The inner growth of the human being is simply a continuation of the evolution of consciousness, which has hitherto resulted successively in the emergence of life out of matter and of mind out of life. In other words, consciousness has developed ever higher forms of its manifestation on earth, from the mineral to the plant, to the animal to the man, the mental being. What is called inner growth refers to the evolution of consciousness beyond mind. Prior to the appearance of the human or mental being, evolution has been a slow, subconscious process. The emergence of mind marks the beginning of a new process of evolution by which the human being, through a conscious will and aspiration for inner growth, becomes a conscious participant and collaborator in the evolution of consciousness. Thus, inner growth is a process of conscious evolution. A system of proven method for achieving inner growth is through yoga. For yoga is a methodized effort towards self-perfection by the expression of the potentialities latent in the being. Even after the emergence of mind, the growth of consciousness in the human being continues to be a more or less unconscious process because the roots of matter, life, and mind lie in the inconsistent out of which they have evolved. The first step for emerging out of the primeval unconsciousness is to develop a conscious ego, a separate and independent individuality. So long as an individuality has not been formed, the human being remains an amorphous entity, more or less fused with the unconscious totality of existence. It is by the development of a conscious ego, individualization of being in becoming, that a person becomes an individual. Ego is the identification of our being with the superficial outer self made up of the body, the vital nature, and the mind. Due to the ego, a certain formation of physical, vital, and mental experience is distinguished from the rest of the being and is regarded as the self. Thus, the ego serves to bring about the emergence from unconsciousness through a progressive consciousness of the physical, vital, and mental aspects of the being. Once the separative ego has been adequately developed, evolution of consciousness can be accelerated through growth in a different dimension, that which lies in the transcendence of the ego, liberation from the ignorant identification with one's superficial nature, and the discovery of the true self. Inner growth thus represents a new dimension of evolution. The divergence among the presently normal state of consciousness and the more evolved state of consciousness at which inner growth aims is reflected in their contrasting characteristics, some of which are indicated below. A. The normal state of consciousness is more or less submerged in unconsciousness. In the normal state, a person is totally unconscious of the deeper and higher level of the being, and largely unconscious of even the superficial being made up of the body consciousness, thoughts, and feelings. With the inner growth of one's being, there comes an increasing consciousness, for consciousness is the very nature and essence of being. One of the chief characteristics of the normal state of consciousness is distractibility. The changing impressions and sensations from the outside and the flux of thoughts and feelings from within produce a state of constant distraction. On the other hand, the inner consciousness is centered or concentrated. As the consciousness grows and one learns to live more and more in the deeper consciousness, one experiences a state of centeredness or concentration. C. Associated with distraction is another characteristic of the normal state of consciousness, namely dispersion. In the normal state, consciousness is scattered, so to speak, in the superficial parts and movements of the being, physical, vital, and mental. The dispersed nature of the normally prevailing consciousness stands in sharp contrast to the ingathered and collected nature of the deeper consciousness. D. The normal state of consciousness is a state of continual disquiet and agitation due to its constant distractibility and dispersion. As the consciousness grows, one becomes more and more aware of a deeper consciousness which is felt as a substrandum of quiet and peace. E. In the normal state, consciousness is evolved and identified with its instruments, the body, the vital nature, and then individual. One feels oneness to be the body, thoughts, and feelings. As consciousness evolves, it experiences itself more and more as detached and separate from the outer physical, vital, and mental nature. Instead of being identified with the movements of the outer nature, it observes them as a detached witness, Sakshi, to use a term of the Gita. F. Because of the identification with its instrumental nature, the ordinary consciousness is afflicted by the pairs of contraries, heat and cold, pleasure and pain, attraction and repulsion, etc., which are an inherent characteristics of physical, vital, and mental nature. Ordinarily, therefore, consciousness is in a more or less constant state of disturbance and disequilibrium. Consistently, the higher consciousness is unmoved, mixed, or steady, sthir, to use another term of the Gita. Associated with this quality is samta, equanimity, born of an equal response to the pairs of contraries. G. A fundamental characteristic of the normal consciousness is sense of being a separate self or ego, that is, of being an individual who exists apart from the rest of the universe. On the other hand, the greater consciousness, as described by those who have attained it permanently or experienced it momentary, is unitary, universal, and transpersonal, devoid of separation and division. The difference from the viewpoint of yoga between personal growth and inner growth may be restated in somewhat different words. Thus, personal growth consists in the development of an individual as a human being, whereas inner growth, which is the aim of yoga, lies in transforming and transcending the human state of consciousness. An important point to note is the even moral development, which is often confused with spirituality, is part of growth that belongs to the human state. It does not constitute inner growth, which aims at a state of the being beyond the human ego bound state. However, just as the development of the ego is indispensable for emerging out of unconsciousness, so too moral development, which is one of the highest aspects of human growth, is a necessary step towards a state of consciousness beyond the humans. Inner growth needs to be distinguished also from what is commonly called the growth of awareness, sought to be fostered by various modern psychological methods and techniques. The term awareness, as used in modern psychology, has acquired a wide range of meanings and connotations, ranging from the detection of a very weak sensory stimulus, such as a dim light, to the acquisition of insight into the unconscious dynamics which motivate one's actions. From the viewpoint of yoga psychology, what is called awareness in gestalt therapy and other similar approaches of psychological growth refers to awareness of the outer or surface being consisting of physical, vital, and mental parts of the human makeup. Growth of such awareness lies in becoming more and more aware of one's body, feelings, emotions, and thoughts. Inner growth, on the other hand, pertains to the progressive awakening and awareness of the inner and higher part of the beings. In the normal state of consciousness in which we are identified with the outer being, the body, impulses and feelings and the mind, we are almost totally unconscious of the inner being and of its constant action on the surface consciousness. We sometimes awaken into the consciousness of the inner being during the sleep of the body and occasionally bring back to the normal wakening consciousness some of our experiences of the inner consciousness during sleep in the form of lucid symbolic or premonitory dreams, though most of our dreams, which are confused and incoherent, pertain not to the inner consciousness but to the subconscient. We also get glimpse of the inner consciousness through certain images perceived either spontaneously or during the practice of visualization, and in rare cases through visions or inner voices. In the state of meditation too, we sometimes become aware of the inner being as a detached, calm and observing consciousness. Apart from these occasional momentary and fragmentary experiences, the inner being is shut out from the outer by the thick wall or veil of the normal surface consciousness. The process of inner growth consists in the gradual breaking down of the wall or the lifting of the veil and awakening to the consciousness of the inner being. A salient aspect of Sri Aurobindo's yoga pertaining to the psychology of inner growth is its view of the inner and higher planes of consciousness as dynamic forces. Though hidden from the outer surface consciousness, the inner and higher parts of the being exercise on the surface parts of the being a constant influence and pressure pushing towards the evolution and growth of consciousness. To sum up, the inner growth of the individual, like the evolution of the universe, is the process by which the supreme consciousness, the truth of existence, or the reality of being emerged in the inconscious of matter through a prior process of evolution manifests itself in progressively higher states of its being due to the evolutionary thrust inherent in it. In Sri Aurobindo's yoga, the supreme consciousness, truth or reality is spoken of as the divine, the supreme beings from whom all have come and in whom all are. The portion of the divine consciousness which develops in the process of evolution is called the soul or the psychic essence. It grows and becomes a distinct individuality referred to as the psychic being. It is through the psychic being that the evolutionary dynamism inherent in the supreme consciousness bring about the inner growth of the individual. Numerous are the paths that have been discovered for achieving inner growth and realizing the truth. The various psychological paths may be classified into three broad types, corresponding to the three basic psychological aspects of the human makeup: the path of knowledge, corresponding to the cognitive or thinking aspect; the path of devotion, related to the affective or emotional side of human nature; and the path of works or action, based on man's cognitive aspect, which has to do with striving and willing. Almost all paths contain elements of each of the three broad types just mentioned, though one particular type element, knowledge, devotion, or works, may predominate. The seeker is drawn to one path or another depending on what predominates in one's psychological makeup.
Well students, now let us summarize what we have learnt in this chapter. In summary, Sri Aurobindo's depiction of personality refers to a lesser self caught up in the demands of the outer being, which can get transformed into greater self via a process of developing, entailing first an inward movement leading to the uncovering of the psychic, then an upward movement through the higher gradations of consciousness, taking one towards the supramental level of awareness, and subsequently a descent of the higher force into the lower parts leading to their transformation. It is the entire human species which is undergoing evolution, and as more and more humans come in contact with the descending supramental force, the essential nature of existence on earth will undergo a radical transformation, and hence the possibility of the life divine.